as or legislative wrap up breakfast. And I know we're not together in person having breakfast, but certainly welcome you all here. I'm getting some feedback on this end, so I'm going to ask if everyone also would mute their phones. I mean, not phones, but just mute things on their end as well. That was better. And so we'll get started in just a second. But for those of you that maybe this is your first one of these, obviously this is the first time we're doing this in a virtual setting. But we tend to do this every year during the legislative session, at the end of the legislative session, where we bring in members of the business community as well as also our elected officials to talk about what happened and perhaps why it happened, and ultimately what would be the impact, particularly on the business community moving forward. And so we're excited today to have with us from the General Assembly, we have with us Senator Katie Fry Hester. We have with us Delegate Jessica Feldmark. And then we also have from the Maryland Chamber, Ashley Duckman. And then we'll have moderating our conversation, Duane Carey, who certainly I think is no stranger to many of us here in Howard County. And so before we get started, certainly want to just recognize and acknowledge our annual partners that help to put on all of our events throughout the course of the year. And for those of you that have been on for a moment, we've had their logos and so forth rotating through this morning virtually so that you can take a look at them. And certainly I would say for your business needs, consider them as resources. Also want to particularly recognize and thank BGE, who has been our premier sponsor for this event at least probably 7 or 8 years or so. BGE has been a great partner of the Howard County Chamber. And so certainly want to thank Megan Eves, who represents BGE and sits on our board of directors. And so Megan is actually with us via telephone and is going to have some remarks. Or Megan, did you want to bring remarks on behalf of BGE, or did you want me to just share on my end the prepared remarks? Let's see if Megan, are you on? Okay, I'm going to bring Megan's comments on her behalf, and I'm sure she'll be joining us before we're complete. And so this is again on behalf of BGE. Even though today's event looks a little different, it's always an honor to be a sponsor and partner with the Chamber. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to evolve in our communities and throughout the world, we at BGE remain steadfast in our determination to power Central Maryland through this crisis. And I'm going to ask if everyone would please mute their lines. This morning, I'd like to keep you informed about the work that we're doing to help ensure every customer has access to safe and reliable natural gas and electric service during this critical time, through pandemic-specific policies and through our essential energy delivery work. We recognize the impact of COVID-19 on our customers and communities, with many experiencing financial difficulties and uncertainty about the future. As a result, we have made the decision to extend the COVID-19 customer service policies we announced last month, which include suspending service disconnections and waiving all new late fees through at least June 1st, 2020. Also, we have been reconnecting service for customers who have contacted us about disconnected service prior to the moratorium. We understand that we all need to come together in support of one another during this difficult time, and extending these policies and offering customers is one of the many ways we're doing just that. We also understand the essential service we provide, which is why the hardworking men and women of BGE are passionately working each day to keep the lights on and the natural gas flowing. The incredible work of these dedicated frontline teams ensures a well-maintained energy delivery system that can withstand the service events like those we have seen recently and are experiencing this morning. Nothing is more important than safety of our customers, employees, and communities. During this pandemic, we will power through together. And with that, I'm going to take it back over from here. But again, just want to continue to thank and acknowledge BGE for all of their support for the Chamber, as well as our respective communities, because certainly They do a lot for Howard County businesses, organizations, and the like. So again, we're going to get ready to turn things over and get started. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator this morning, which is Duane Carey. And just a little bit about Duane for those of you that perhaps do not know Duane. Duane, as he likes to say, his day job is owner and lead strategist of impact marketing and public relations. But one of his passions is also being president of Maryland Free Enterprise Foundation, which is a 36-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit that seeks to improve the business climate in Maryland. The organization compiles an annual accounting of how our state legislators voted on bills and amendments that affect the economy, job creation, and the autonomy of business owners with regard to operating their companies and managing their human resources. Duane has an MBA from Johns Hopkins University. Proud to say he is a former Business Person of the Year for the Howard County Chamber. He's also served on Governor Hogan's One Maryland Blue Ribbon Commission. He's been a trustee at the Howard County Hospital Foundation, and also speaks throughout the state of Maryland on a number of business and marketing, business development topics. And so certainly it's my pleasure to turn things over to Duane Carey, who will introduce formally our participants and get us started on our conversation here. I will mention again, I'm going to go through the list and mute you guys on my end if you're not already muted, just to try to ensure that, unlike myself, you don't have to hear a barking dog in the background. And so, and then also, we'll be taking questions as well, and you can utilize the chat feature, or I think there's probably a feature here where you can raise your hand, and I'll be certainly monitoring the participant listing as well. And so with that, Duane, the screen is yours.
Sounds great, Leonardo. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right, awesome. I was actually going to mention too, regarding questions from the audience. I know some people are going to be texting me throughout this, so I thought I might just give everybody my number, and if anybody wants to text me, it's 443-472-2574. If you want, there's questions in there, comments, any kind of feedback, that's fine. I was two quick things. One, as a former chair of the board of the chamber, I want to just acknowledge Leonardo and his team. I've been really impressed with the speed and the volume and the accuracy of the resources that they've been pushing out. I think the frequency of emails from the chamber has probably at least quintupled during this crisis, and I think it's been really a great service to the employer community. So, Leonardo, thank you, and to your staff. And on that same point, let's all remember, if anyone's on the line that's not a member, please consider joining the chamber. And if you are, and your renewal is coming up anytime soon, please pay that quicker than you pay other things. Running a nonprofit right now is going to be challenging. So, Leonardo, thank you for everything you do. The other thing I just wanted to say, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Duane, thank you for those comments as well. And I'll just speak just really quickly on the email piece. It's interesting when you talk about how they quintupled, and that's been one of those things that I've noticed myself, obviously. But I will say, for those listening, we've thought it was important to make sure that we continue to provide up-to-date information. I don't like sending daily emails just because I understand that our inboxes get full. And, it used to be what I would call the Joseph A. Banks syndrome, where you get 3 emails a day or something like that. Now I'm going to call it the DSW syndrome, where they probably send 4 or 5. But on a serious note, we felt that it was important to keep you abreast of all of the changing policy decisions that are being made. And so we have increased the frequency of our messaging to typically once a day. But again, it's all with trying to continue to provide adequate information so that you can make quality business decisions for outside of yourself as a business owner, but also for your employees as well. So back to you, Duane.
Yeah, and they're good and concise communication. So I think everybody appreciates it. The other thing I want to say was, what I'm really going to miss about this, not having a live audience, is that I won't be able to hear Jeff Agnor with his big hearty laughs every time there's a joke. So, Jeff, just through chat, you have to laugh. All right, let's get to it. This is great. We've got a really great panel. Um, two of our local legislators, and then a great lobbyist for the chamber, the state chamber. Let's start with Delegate Feldmark. We all know Jessica well. Jessica's a member of the House of Delegates since January 9th, 2019, on several subcommittees, but of note, she's a member of the Ways and Means Committee, which is a really important committee, which originates a lot of the bills we're going to be talking about today. She's part of the Election Law Subcommittee, the Revenue Subcommittee. She's also part of the Joint Committee on Cyber Technology, Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and Biotechnology. Most of us here in Howard County obviously know Jessica from her time as Chief of Staff to the County Executive, and that's from 2009 to 2014. But she worked with him for 3 years prior as well. And I always remember thinking, does this woman ever sleep when she worked for Ken? It was, I mean, easily, I think she worked 20 hours a day, every day. Jessica has degrees from Goucher College and a master's from American. And she's on the board of directors of NARAL Pro-Choice Maryland and is the past member of the board of directors of the Wild Lake Village. Senator Katie Fry Hester, also serving her first term in the Maryland Senate. She's in the 9th District. Prior to her service in the legislature, she spent 20 years in the private sector to foster sustainable development, multi-sector partnerships, stakeholder engagement, and effective strategic planning with the aim of solving large, complex problems. Throughout her career, she's worked with Fortune 500 companies, small businesses, governments, communities, and nonprofits to create win-win partnerships for sustainable international development. She has a degree from Cornell in agricultural and biological engineering and lives in Western Howard County with her husband, Bill, and their 2 daughters. Ashley Duckman is the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Maryland Chamber. As the VP, she leads advocacy efforts on behalf of the 4,500 plus members of the Maryland Chamber before the Maryland General Assembly and on the federal level as well. Her responsibilities include developing, leading, and executing the legislative strategy of the organization and maintaining positive working relationships with key elected officials and members of the administration in order to build a better understanding of and appreciation for business issues. Previous to the chamber, Ashley served as Senior Director of Governmental Affairs and Public Policy for the American Gas Association. So she has a lot of DC experience. In this capacity, she assisted in managing AGA's federal government relations goals and programs, including advocacy and outreach on the Hill, on energy and environment issues, infrastructure, energy efficiency, and the role of natural gas in a lower carbon future. Ashley has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Economics from Washington College in Chestertown. And if we see her 3-year-old on the screen, that'll be just a little bonus for the rest of us. Okay. We're generally going to look at kind of 3 big areas today, and none of it will be a surprise. It's pretty similar to what we do each year. What has happened, what we think is going to happen, and then this thing called COVID that's happening right now, which is obviously an undercurrent of everything going on. It greatly affected the end of the shortened legislative session, and obviously it's something we're going to be dealing with for quite a while. So that will be an undercurrent that kind of inserts itself, I think, in each one of the items that we'll discuss. We will definitely spend a lot of time on spending and taxation. Obviously, we'll spend a lot of time on Kerwin. We'll spend some time on some local bills. But what I wanted to do first was go through each of the panelists and just take a few minutes. So this is not a debate. This is a forum. This is a discussion. So we're not going to have rules on exactly how long someone can speak. Let's just get a conversation going. That I've always found when I'm in the audience of this, I most appreciate it when the panelists do most of the talking and not the moderator. So that's what we'll try to do. If each of you can go, let's start with Ashley, and just paint us a picture of where we are and where we think we're going. What's the state of the state in your opinion?
Sure, and hopefully you can hear me well. First, I just want to say thank you to Leonardo and his team at the Howard County Chamber and to Duane for moderating this great event. Leonardo is just one of the best in terms of local and county chamber participation with us at the Maryland Chamber, and so we're very grateful for his partnership and collaboration. So I'd be remiss if I didn't start with that. I think obviously, where we are today, COVID. And I think a lot of how session ended and a lot of how we're going to move into what might be a special session, or if it's not, into January, will be informed with COVID as the backdrop. I think as we were headed into session last fall, which seems like light years ago, it was really sort of the Kirwan Commission and how that was going to play out in the legislature that served as the backdrop for all of the decision making and all of the advocacy that was happening. And then very quickly, we learned, in early March that was, sort of replaced with COVID. And so I think moving forward, what we're really working on and interested in and looking at is, okay, what is going to be sort of the near, mid, and long-term policy required at the state executive and legislative level to support business as we move through this crisis. And I know that it would be an understatement. It would be, silly of me to try to suggest to this audience that it is a major impact to you and your businesses. And that's just the understatement of the century. Everyone's hurting really badly right now. And so we at the State Chamber are trying to aggregate and figure out, quickly pivot what those policies are going to be moving forward, sort of leaving what happened in January through March behind and looking forward to what needs to happen into the future.
Delegate Feldmark.
Thank you. Good morning. And I want to thank you for having us. And this is a new and different way to have this event, which I've been to many times in the past. And I want to start off really by recognizing Ashley. As Duane mentioned, I serve on the Ways and Means Committee and have a chance to observe her in work every day. We spend a lot of quality time together in the hearing room, and she is definitely dedicated, putting in the long hours, and a really good source of information for the legislators also. So thank you. From my perspective, in terms of a session overview, I think I'll look first at the big three: education, budget, and COVID. Right? Education, as Ashley mentioned, going into the session, the Blueprint for Maryland's Future was really our primary focus. Built to Learn Act, another huge piece on school construction funding, and one that is really important to Howard County. So education was certainly the theme of the session at the beginning. The budget, obviously, is always a major focus. It is, the one piece of legislation that we have to adopt every year. And then COVID, which took over, shaped the end of our session. We adjourned early for the first time since the Civil War. So just to put that in perspective of how significant this pandemic is. And of course, that was March 18th. And since then, we're just learning more about how extensive the impact is going to be. And I think all of us are really focused on getting through this and figuring out what recovery looks like and how we do that as quickly and as effectively as possible. So those were sort of the three big themes shaping the session. In terms of business highlights, in terms of legislation that came through Ways and Means, I see three sort of main highlights. Our pass-through entities legislation, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. the data center tax credit, which was a big accomplishment and one that I hope will serve Howard County well. And also the small business innovation research grants for technology transfer and technical assistance around that, which I think will hopefully Howard County businesses will be taking advantage of also. I do want to quickly just highlight from my personal legislation, we have, with the session being cut short, a number of bills were sort of just victim of the timing. I did have 2 pieces of legislation that did make it through. One is business related. It's an apprenticeship startup tax credit. And we can talk more about that later. The other, I just want to mention as a side note, it's not particularly business focused, but it is, I think, a really important piece, and that is extending whistleblower protections for our Department of Juvenile Service employees so that they can report concerns to the Juvenile Justice Monitoring Unit. And I know that's kind of an aside for our topic today, but I just wanted to mention it because it is a really important piece of legislation that I'm really thankful we were able to get passed before we adjourned early. So with that, I'll wait for questions and how the conversation evolves. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Delegate. Senator Hester?
There, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I want to start also by thanking the Chamber for holding this event, and Duane for moderating, and Ashley for being, really helpful throughout session and also currently on our small business working group. I agree with everything she said about right now being COVID. Immediately after we adjourned, our office started receiving calls from small business, owners, for people who were unemployed. We probably fielded over 100 individual calls in the past, month, which have required research. And there is people are scared right now. And I just wanted to say that if there's anything that we can do, please don't hesitate to reach out to our office. Ashley touched on the near, medium, and long term, nature of COVID. And Jessica mentioned that we adjourned for the first time since the Civil War. With the potential of coming back for a special session. And I think that that's where the legislature is looking right now. There is a COVID-19 joint committee that meets every Wednesday at 10 o'clock, and those meetings are streamed on YouTube. And what we're really doing is kind of monitoring the current situation, as well as, thinking about, recovery going forward. And I think a lot of whether we come back for a special session or not will be influenced by the necessity of whether legislation is necessary to support the recovery. I think the big 3 Jessica mentioned was spot on. And the one thing I wanted to add from a personal perspective, and I don't know, Leonardo, if you got this slide or not, we had started last year a bipartisan small business working group. And, that was a big learning for me after my first year in session, is that a lot of the bipartisan collaboration happens, over the interim and within the committees. And so we formed this group in the Senate, which includes about 8 senators. And then also, the Chamber is on it, the Howard County Chamber is on it, NFIB is on it, the Farm Bureau. And we had these, 8 bills, and Jessica mentioned this income tax pass-through entities, which will impact about 130,000 businesses in the state of Maryland. So if you are an LLC, you really want to listen to what Jessica has to say when she describes it in detail, and make sure you talk to your accountant, because it's a great one. One of my bills that passed was the small business regulatory burden reduction. And I can talk more about that later, but it basically saves small businesses time and money by avoiding having to apply and qualify for a regulation that's duplicative at the state and the local level. Another great bill here that got stalled due to our shortened time frame was the small business health options plan tax credit. That was something that everybody was on board with, and just basically got stalled in both committees, and I'm happy to answer questions on that. But those were the 3 I wanted to throw out. And when we talk about the recovery phase, I just wanted to mention that the Small Business Working Group is really looking at creative ideas right now for potential legislation going forward. And, it's just great to be working, in partnership with government and the private sector going forward. So I will stop there, and hopefully we can revisit a lot of these topics through the Q&A. Thank you.
Senator Hester, before we leave you, why don't we let's talk a little bit more about a special session, and then we'll kind of go back in reverse with the panelists. I know there's been a lot of speculation. I think the latest is that we're not doing one. A, what's your prediction? Will we have one? B, when? And C, probably more importantly, what would be taken up? In your mind, would it be only COVID-related recovery type items? Would we be looking at overturning gubernatorial vetoes? Would we be looking at some of the other bills, such as you just mentioned, that didn't make it through yet? What's the flavor there of a special session in your mind?
Well, I'm looking at my crystal ball here. And, I think the announcement that was made is that we were not going to have this special session in mid-May as originally anticipated. And that is because to come back together in person at this point would just be too hard to do the social distancing. What I will say is that our standing committees are meeting virtually. So I sit on education, health, environment, and environmental affairs. And we are actively talking about election law and what that means given our primaries coming up. And I assume other committees are doing the same. And I think that we are poised to come back. Should any of these committees have legislation that cannot wait? At the same time, in our call yesterday with a small business group, we were talking about the really broad-reaching powers that the governor has under the state of emergency. And so there's that, we're still trying to figure out what the legislative role is in a state of emergency. And one of the things I think that's really important is that with the administration doing, focusing right now on response, we can look medium to longer term at some of these issues. So I know that's not a perfect answer, Duane, but
Can be one.
I know. But if we're meeting, if the standing committees are meeting during the interim, that is not normal.
Okay. Ashley, thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think agree with everything that Senator Hester shared. I think that from my interactions with legislators, particularly through the Small Business Working Group, I think there is an effort underway to try to determine what is the governor's statutory authority during a state of emergency versus what will require state legislative action. And I would pose that if we get to a point for some of these, what we would characterize as midterm recovery policies that require legislative action, if we wait until January to have some of those things enacted, and I can get into maybe some suggestions of hypotheticals of what they could be, we may put ourselves behind other states that are still actively meeting on an ongoing basis. So my hope is that the legislature will reconvene at a time when it's safe to talk through some of these policy proposals that are sort of starting to emerge. And when I say that, I mean things like liability protection from business. If the federal, we saw in the press this morning that the federal government is working to address some of those liability protection concerns, but if they can't, and it's delegated to states, it's very important that something be done as we move into the reopening phase of recovery to protect business from needless lawsuits and litigation and the rising cost of that. So that would be one area. Tax treatment, some sort of fiscal and tax issues that might require state legislative action. So I think we're now getting into the part of the COVID arc where we're starting to figure out whether or not the state legislature will need to act. And if they do, it's my hope that they'll come back before January and not wait until then, and then a prolonged session to address some of these bigger concerns that and support that business will need to reopen as we move into the phase 1, 2, and 3 of recovery.
Okay. Delegate Feldmark, as you answer this, so I think so it's normally a 90-day session. I think we did 70-ish. Would would the special session be the remainder of the 20 or so, or would it be shorter? Can't be longer, I assume, right?
So, so let me hold on that and just real quickly to kind of echo a lot of what Senator Hester and Ashley have already shared. I do think one thing to keep in mind is that in this state of emergency, we are seeing actually very strong bipartisan cooperation. The presiding officers and the governor are working very closely together. And so I do think the decision about whether and when we would come back into special session will be a coordinated effort. And, I think we need to see as plans evolve what those steps, as Ashley mentioned, what those possible steps that could require legislative action before we come back into session in January would be. So then to get to the technical question about timing, and I appreciate, Duane, that we had a brief conversation where you had raised this question. So I actually pulled up my handy dandy Maryland Constitution, and and the General Assembly may continue its session so long as in its judgment the public interest may require for a period not longer than 90 days in each year. But that refers to the session that begins in January.
Yeah.
Special sessions are in addition to the 90-day max for the regular session. So it would not necessarily be the remainder of the 90 days. We would not necessarily have to complete 90 days in the year. It would just be based on the legislative needs and how long it takes to get done whatever the purpose of coming back together is.
Okay. So you could potentially be there 30 or 40 days if leadership.
If you have 30 or 40 days worth of work to do, yes, it is theoretically possible. I do think we will, if we come back together, it would be probably with a fairly clear-cut agenda and probably not that extensive.
Yeah. If I could just totally agree with what Delegate Feldmark just said, I think it would be very much pre-orchestrated. I think that there would be non-controversial bills that folks basically agree on, and that, we'd have double sessions, both days, and try to get in and out of there as quickly as possible. That's kind of what I see happening.
Great.
Yeah, I think as legislators, we know that if we are called back into special session, this is not a time to brainstorm creative legislation we might want to think about. It would be, focused on the needs at hand.
Well, I can tell you that the audience is thrilled to hear that there's bipartisanship going on during this time. That's something we've all been clamoring for a long time. So that's great to hear. Out of order a little bit with what I had prepared, because I think both what the delegate and the senator just mentioned, it brought up some thoughts in my mind about this balancing the state budget bill that was passed. That is set to go to referendum in, I guess, in the fall. I have to just say I was pretty shocked when I actually read it and read about it and saw what the name of the bill isn't exactly what is going on. So balancing the budget is already required by the Constitution. What the bill actually does is, first of all, it feels very misleading to a lot of people who read it, because when the public goes to vote on this referendum, they're going to say, well, sure, yeah, of course you should balance the budget. But it's really about the legislature usurping the governor's ability to set budgets. And it strikes me at a time like this. So the governor would set a budget, and so let's say it's $43 billion. The legislature can go in, if this passes, and take that same $43 billion. They can't increase it, but they would reallocate within it. So it really strips the governor of ability to handle his own budget. How would something like that, like let's say we had that at this point right now, how would that affect our ability to respond to a crisis like this? It seems to me you need a leader Democrat, Republican, whomever. That's what a governor is for. He's a chief executive. He's an administrator. If you suddenly have 188 legislators all looking to take care of their own districts, how would that be workable? And that's for everybody, but it kind of struck me in hearing some of the other comments. We can start with you, Jessica, since we're on screen.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of different issues when we look at budgetary authority and when we look at what's happening right now in a state of emergency, and even taking away the state of emergency just in the interim, right? The governor has authority to make limited budget amendments during the interim, and those, with the approval of the Board of Public Works. So what happens in the interim, or what's happening now under the state of emergency, is separate from the legislative process of approving the budget bill. Okay. So what this would deal with is the legislative process of approving the budget bill. And Maryland does have a very strong executive budget process, one of the strongest. We see that at the local level too in Howard County. The county executive is a very strong, executive power in the budget. What this would do is balance it a little bit more with giving the legislature more budgetary power, which is common in other states. This is not, this is not unique. And I think what's important to notice is that this is about reallocating funds within the budget, that the legislature already has the ability to cut funds from what the governor has proposed in terms of how to use them. This would allow them to not just cut, but say, this is where we think they should be used instead. And so that can go into effect, where we don't have this situation where funds are left unspent because they're fenced off and there's just not agreement on how to spend them. So I think it's not as drastic of a change as it may appear. It is significant in terms of sort of adjusting the balance of powers between the executive and the legislature, but it's not as as significant, and it's not something that individual legislators would be able to control, right? Obviously, it would have to be both bodies together coming to agreement.
So if I could just add on to what the delegate said, is a really interesting bill. And, I think that it may be new for Maryland, but we're actually in the minority right now in terms of the states that do not have this power. And I also just want to point out, since we're talking about bipartisan, collaboration, for context, this bill has been put forward 11 times since 2000 by a bipartisan group of legislators, who've included Senator David Brinkley, and Senator Chris Van Hollen over the years. So it's not a Democrat or Republican issue. And I think, what the delegate said about it maintaining balance within the budget process is spot on. And in a time of crisis like this, it would allow us to move money from one part of the budget to another, which we currently can't do. And so I just,
So you see it helping in a time of crisis like this. My question was kind of, is it a negative, but you see it as a positive?
I see it as a positive, and it also includes a line item veto for the governor. So it's just, there still is a balance of power, but I think it's a slight shift. And once again, it will be on the ballot this year. So, the public can decide.
Can that line item veto be overturned with a supermajority of the legislature?
Oof, that's a good question. Above my pay grade.
I would imagine it would be.
There would also be a timing issue to that, right? Because if the line item veto, if that happens after the session has ended, it may or may not be something that the General Assembly would be able to deal with before the next session. at that point, you're already halfway through the fiscal year, so.
Okay. Unless
Right.
it calls a special session. Ashley?
On this one, on that bill in particular, the chamber did not take a position. And the reason is because as it relates to issues of the budget, we sort of stay away from that and instead focus our attention on those bills that are specific have specific tax and fiscal implications for business rather than the state. A lot of those obviously have to do with bills that would raise revenue for the state and feed into that budget process that would be on the back of business. So we didn't weigh in on this one publicly. I will say, Duane, that internally within some of our membership, we did share some of the same concern about it being a little bit misleading, the title of it, and sort of what the educational campaign would be around making sure that the electorate was aware of exactly what this referendum would do. So there was within my membership some concern over that, which is not to say that we don't trust the electorate to do their research and know what they're voting for when they go to the polls. But, looking at the title and understanding sort of how it made its way through the process toward the very end of session and not having direct access as we usually do to the legislature because of social distancing and because of not being able to actually go to the building. There was a little bit of angst over it. But I think, we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of months as we head into November. But from my perspective, the chamber doesn't intend to take an official position on whether this is good or bad policy.
Okay, great. It certainly made some news at the end of the session. Okay, well, so we've already gotten a little wonky here, and this is what we do in this event. I think maybe why don't we take a short break on the wonkiness and go a little more philosophical for just a minute, and we can start with you, Ashley, since we have you here.
Sure.
So, Ashley, you're in your first year at the chamber. Both the delegate and the senator are in their first terms in the legislature. The question is, what one thing have you learned about business in that 1 year that has changed your perspective in some way?
Well, one thing have I learned about business that has changed my perspective? Well, first, I will say that we at the chamber represent 4,500 different businesses, right? So we represent members that are from the micro mom and pop shop all the way up onto your, big, you name them, Comcast, BG&E, et cetera. And so there's...
Can I pause you just for 1 second?
Sure.
I should restate that slightly as not just business, but employment, because we certainly represent a lot of employers that are not necessarily businesses, they're nonprofits. Sure. So much of it is about the struggles that employers have in dealing with legislation and regulation. It's that perspective from which I'm asking the question.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And so, and to your point, we represent employers across the spread, right? There are nonprofits in my membership all the way up onto your big corporations. And so there is a vast difference between them in terms of how they focus on policy. So one thing I've learned is that consensus building can be very hard, even within the business community. That's one thing. But I think in my career, obviously I've represent utilities before I joined the chamber, and so have had a perspective on business and business issues before joining the chamber. But I think a lot of what I've learned in my tenure has been really more focused in the labor and employment space. Certainly all businesses have employees, and we think about policies like sick and safe leave and minimum wage. And those were issues that I had not previously dealt with in my career. And going into this session and working on advocacy on, for example, the Paid Family and Medical Leave Act, really learned a lot about employers and their real want to take care of their employees across the board. There is not a reticence from among employers to want to take care of their employees, whether it's sick and safe leave or minimum wage or paid family and medical leave. The issue is, how do we balance those kinds of policies with the economic realities that employers face and the many masters that they have to answer to and the many things they have to consider on their books when they think about balancing the needs of their employees with their sort of economic situation. And so that was really eye-opening for me because, of course, labor and employment weren't issues that I have worked on in the past. And so going through this session, I would say the issue that jumped out was paid family and medical leave got some attention this session, and certainly getting some more attention in the post-COVID space as we think about what employees will need to adjust to sort of this new normal, which the phrase new normal doesn't pull well, so I don't like to say it, but it is really a new normal. And so I would say that that's been really eye-opening to me. And employers care genuinely about their employees. They are our families, they are our communities, and we want to be able to support them through these kinds of programs, but we have to do it in a way that balances our economic sort of realities. And so that's been a really a big learning experience for me and better understanding that.
Okay, great. Senator Hester?
I think she's on mute.
No, I just wanted to say, I really appreciate the question. When you read my bio, I was like, wow, that's kind of sounds really wonky when I'm listening to my own bio. But what I've been doing for 20 years is building these partnerships between business, government, and civil society. And these big challenges that we face, require people working together, which is one of the reasons I started the bipartisan small business, working group, because in order to make good legislation, we need to be in active conversation with business. At some point, Ashley and I were talking about how, the chamber plays like defense. And so the whole point was trying to make legislation that would support small business. So whether we're talking about climate change, and you look at the the Clean Energy Jobs Act of last year, or I chair the cybersecurity joint committee, and looking at workforce development on cyber. Like, things are changing so fast. So we've had a lot of really good conversations with the cybersecurity industry. But I would just say that if there's anything that I've learned in the past couple of years, is that now that I'm on the government side as opposed to the business side, having those upfront relationships built and the knowledge of what's going on in the business sector is invaluable on the front end, because we go so fast in a normal 90-day session. We go even faster in a 70-day session. And if you don't know what's going on with business, and a lot, and there's all this nuance, as you said, Ashley. There's small business, there's medium business, there's micro business, there's large business, and it can all get lumped together. I spent a lot of time thinking about if we could define small business in code, and we can't, because it's all over the place. But I think having business at the table, helping to shape good quality legislation, will gives us a better success rate and avoid some of the kind of fights on the floor that you would otherwise see.
Okay. Delegate, one thing have you learned about business or employment?
Well, I think sort of building on some of what was already said, when a new legislator is elected, we take office the first day of session. And that is really coming into the process at what should be the end of the process. And one of the things that I've learned is how important the interim is for having conversations outside of legislative drafting, right? Having conversations to get to understand that you may actually have agreement on the policy goal, and it's concern about the implementation and the bureaucracy it's creating, and the how folks are going to comply with the regulation. So I think really sort of, as as Ashley said, understanding employment issues, particularly that employers care about their employees. They want them to be happy and healthy and productive, right? And so finding that mutual, that common ground, and identifying what the concerns are and working together on how to address them in a realistic and viable way, so that it's not a common goal that becomes a point of controversy because of the implementation. The other thing that I have learned, and I learned a new term, and I learned this in the context of liquor law or alcohol laws, right? And the term is Franken law, okay? And that's, bit by bit, piece by piece, things get changed and stitched together in the code, and it's not unique to alcohol. It's in a lot of our code. It's in tax policy, right, where things have just been patchwork together and evolved in a way that as a legislator, it's hard to dive in and make sense of it. As a business person who's just trying to focus on your core mission and your business, and then, to be left with this complex mess of law can be really challenging. And I think the more we can do to simplify and be clear about what is our intent, right? What is the goal of this policy and what's the most direct way to get there? So those are, I guess, a couple of things that so far have struck me.
Okay, great. 3 quick points. Just a reminder to everybody to please mute your microphone if you're not one of the panelists. 2, Jessica, on that point, it brings up a phrase that, and we don't need to talk about this right now, but just as a reminder for everyone, one of the things that the business and employer communities seek more than anything is predictability. And when we're given something here in this program or in this year, and then the next year it's different, we can't build our businesses. We can't plan our businesses. It's a big deal. 3, I want to get to Kerwin and a lot of the spending and taxation bills that are associated with that. But I want to first jump into, and we can start with you, Delegate, a question from the audience that just came in. We've dealt with minimum wage now for several years, and the business community was really shouting from the rooftops that this is a really bad idea. It actually hurts the very people that it purports to help because they lose hours, they lose positions. It statistically, it really doesn't work. According to the questioner, I guess in late January or the beginning of January is when the next phase is supposed to happen. What can we do to delay that? Do you agree with delaying that? What can we do? We're in an economic crisis. We all believe on the business and employment side that only deepens things. When you raise the barriers to employment, you get less employment. Thoughts on that?
Well, excuse me. I think, the minimum wage legislation last year was, I think, an example of where the business community was very effective in shaping some amendments. So the bill that we ultimately adopted was, different from what was originally introduced. And one of those amendments was what is referred to as an off-ramp. Okay, a recognition that if we see significant economic downturn, that's not the time to increase minimum wage.
Was that codified numerically?
So it is defined by negative job growth over 6 months. Okay, so over a 6-month period, statewide negative job growth. Unfortunately, I think we're likely to see that utilized.
Yeah.
So, and I say unfortunately because of what it means about our economic state.
Totally.
Because I think,
Understood.
So that was a provision that was put in anticipation of an economic downturn and the problems that would, compound. So I am expecting that we will probably see that utilized in this situation.
Interestingly, though, isn't it also tied to inflation? And I wonder, with you get stagflation sometimes in these kinds of situations, especially when you have so much cash being pumped into the economy. And we have a lot of supply issues right now. We might be seeing costs of beef and chicken and gas and all kinds of things going up. Do you know which trumps which? Would the off-ramp trump the automatic triggering with inflation?
My understanding is that the 6-month negative job growth is what would control it. It's basically just a 1-year delay of the entire scale.
Okay. All right.
So,
Ashley?
Yes, that's our understanding as well. And just taking it back one step before I dive into this specific issue, we at the Maryland Chamber are working on a series of policy proposals that we'd be advocating for in a post-COVID economy to figure out what we can do to support small businesses. And the rising the cost of labor is certainly of concern, and maintaining the cost of labor and not increasing it in a time when business is trying to recover is critically important. So dealing with this minimum wage issue will be one of our proposals moving forward. There is this stopgap, this off-ramp that exists in the current law, but it is a one-time freeze of the minimum wage. And we're predicting economic recovery that lasts anywhere from 18 to 24 months, maybe longer, depending on how this shakes out. I mean, economists are sort of all over the place with respect to how recovery is going to look. Is it going to look U-shaped? Is it going to look like a Nike swoosh V-shaped? And we just can't predict that. So we at the Chamber would argue that a one-time freeze is probably not enough, that we need to be looking at something potentially a little bit longer. I think where we're thinking, and I don't want to say this necessarily as on the record, or I think that we are open to discussion. I think we're open to working with policymakers and other business groups to figure out what the appropriate length of time to freeze the minimum wage is. But we think at least 2 years, which dovetails with some of the payback of businesses that have gotten those PPP loans that won't be forgiven. They have about 2 years to pay them back. So recognizing that that's kind of a parentheses, kind of 2 years is kind of like a time frame that's been aligned with a lot of different policies. We think at least a 2-year freeze of minimum wage is necessary, and you wouldn't be able to do that in the existing statute. So that would require some additional legislative action.
And wouldn't you have to do that in a special session though? Because you're going to have 2 weeks in the next session before it goes into effect.
Well, presuming that BPW uses its existing statutory authority to stop the next one, which would be January 2021, then we'd be looking at legislative action to do another stop. So potentially, presumably, I mean, and again, everything has nuance, and there are legislative scholars who are far more versed in this than I am. But presumably, using the existing stopgap, BPW could call for the freeze for January 2021, and then we could look into a regular session to figure out what a longer freeze would be, of another year or another 2 years.
That seems like a great proposal.
Right. If I can jump in, I think that was part of the rationale with the 1 year, is that's always enough time to revisit if things have changed beyond what was envisioned.
Okay. Senator Hester?
I think they've pretty much, said it all. I fully expect the governor to pull that escape valve and give us a 1 year pause.
Okay. So let's jump then into, speaking of pauses, we have some fiscal issues. So the fiscal analysts for the state were already, before COVID, were predicting a $900 million deficit for 2022. And then climbing to 1.2 and 1.4 after that. And I just read the other day that Controller Francho is predicting now a $2.8 million budget shortfall. Yet we passed this massive $32 billion. Is that what Kerwin is in the waning hours of the session? What's going to happen with Kerwin, A? And I think we're clearly going to see the governor veto. So I would love to get some input. I don't know if you'll be willing to answer this yet, but I have to ask, will you vote to sustain the veto or vote to overturn the veto when it happens? And where are we? I know that there's a stopgap of the, I think it's 7.5% retraction in the economy, but it's such a bigger bill than that. It's a much bigger bill than just 1 year, and it's $4 billion a year going forward. Where does Kerwin? What's your thinking, and where does Kerwin fit within where we find ourselves today economically?
Right. Well, that is a big question, and I'm happy to take a stab at components of it. Let me start by saying that the next 3 years of the Kerwin are already paid for. A lot of that goes back to the original blueprint last year. And so I mean, that puts us in good shape. The second thing is that there, as you mentioned, there is this funding deficit, escape hatch. So if the estimated general funds revenues, as reported by the Board of Revenue Estimates, decreased by more than 7.5%, which once again, unfortunately, we're probably there, then the funding in the blueprint will be limited to inflation beginning as soon as fiscal 2022. So that is built in, and it was one of the reasons why I think a number of folks felt comfortable voting for the bill. At the same time, we saw the pandemic, bearing down at us and the potential economic implications of that. So all that said, I think it's a really interesting question because so much of the blueprint was focused on college and career readiness and being career ready. So in the bill, it created a CTE committee with the Governor's Workforce Development Board to really help match students coming out of school with what employers needed. And if you're at a point where you're looking at massive unemployment, you really want people coming out to have the right skills. So I think it's a very interesting question about the funding, but the retooling and the of our education system, making sure that kids can get employed and making sure that this is matched, which we've been talking about, between what the business community needs and what the government is offering, is just incredibly important to a strong recovery.
Okay, Ashley?
Sure. So, on the Kerwin Commission, the chamber did not take a position on the commission and the recommendations contained within it. I think we acknowledge that there are education policy experts that are far better versed in understanding what we need as a state in that space. But the big question, to your point, Duane, was how are we going to pay for Kerwin? And I know the senator mentioned that the first 3 years were paid for, but looking out beyond that, our focus during session was on all of the revenue proposals that were put forward to try to cover what that spend would be after those 3 years. And most of that policy was focused on revenue proposals that were driven by, tax increases or sort of tax treatment of businesses. They were things like the digital ad tax. They were things like eliminating tax incentives. For some of the larger businesses, things like, a little bit more complicated and nuanced tax policy, like the throwback rule and combined reporting. And so I think recognizing that obviously workforce development and talent pipeline is critically important for industry, for economic development, and for business, it's only as important as having the jobs available for those folks when they come out of that pipeline. And achieving that balance of wanting to make sure that the state does remain economically competitive with our neighboring states. That was really our focus. And so we were grateful that the General Assembly sort of towards the end of session and acknowledged this massive economic downturn that we were headed toward and pivoted away from some of those policies that were directed at raising revenue for Kerwin, the combined reporting and elimination of tax incentives, et cetera. But I think moving forward, the conversation around that has just changed so fundamentally, recognizing the situation that the business community finds itself in a post-COVID world. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves into next session. The other thing I think is important to pay attention to is we're predicting a $2.8 billion deficit, but we're also having conversations at the federal level about what the additional support for states is going to be. So I think some of that will be balanced out, hopefully, by support we get from the federal government in trying to mitigate that massive deficit. But at the same time, a lot of the policies that the business community is going to advocate for have some expense to the state, whether that's in lost revenue or whether that's in a tax credit or whether that's in more money in some of these programs that, for example, Commerce put together that have been really effective. So we're just trying to balance all of that. And again, it's to the senator and the delegate's point, all of this exists in a balance and working together and collaboratively to figure out, okay, where do we align on our policy goals and how can we structure this so we're getting the best outcomes. But I think that sort of has been our focus and will be moving forward.
Okay. Delegate Feldmark, as you address I'm getting some. Can you hear me okay?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
Delegate Feldmark, as you addressed Kerwin, actually alluded a little bit to some of the bills that would effectively raise taxes on business. One of them is your bill, HB 565, which was pretty much a blanket reduction or elimination of tax credits that terminated enterprise zones, One Maryland, Opportunity Zone Enhancement, biotech, film production. Some of these were amended a little bit, I think, as the bill went through. But the big question with that is, it passed in the House, and then in the last couple of days, with all the rush, kind of died in the Senate. Knowing where we are now, will you be bringing that back to help to try to pay a little bit into the Kerwin, or will you let that go at a time like this when we need these tax credits?
Sure. So I can speak to that. So that was actually Chair Kaiser's bill, and I did co-sponsor it. And one of the things that Delegate Kaiser, as chair of the Ways and Means Committee, made clear in the hearing was it was a broad proposal to reevaluate all of the credits that were included, and that process did unfold and evolve, and that evaluation took place. And the final bill that passed was significantly cut back from what the original proposal was, which was just sort of put it all on the table. One piece that I think was particularly important that we developed by amendment, and this is a piece that I am interested in pursuing, whether it needs to be done legislatively or we may have some ways to work on it practically without legislation, was restructuring our tax credit evaluation program. And this goes back to, I think, a point we made earlier about really understanding what the goal of policy is and what the intent of policy is, and what is the intent of the tax credits that we have provided over time. Generally a tax credit is introduced as an incentive to get a certain behavior, or to help make it worthwhile to do something that otherwise might not happen. And yet we don't necessarily see the evaluation showing that these tax credits are serving their intended purpose. And so the piece that I really think is important, what came out of that bill in its final form, was a revised process for clarifying the goals of tax credits and evaluating them over time to make sure we're achieving policy goals. So that's the main piece that I really want to continue to focus on.
Okay. Ashley, as a follow-up to that, with the final bill, where does the chamber view that? And especially if it sounds like it'll probably be reintroduced again next year. Where does the chamber sit with it? And with regard to opportunity zones and enterprise zones, the things I think affect some of the areas where we desperately need employment, are those still in the bill?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Delegate Feldmark, but I think a lot of that was either stripped or modified significantly in the final, what passed the House.
Yeah, what finally passed the House was really just some very minor changes, with the primary focus being on that tax credit evaluation process moving forward.
Okay.
I will say that one of the major concerns that the chamber had is that process. Well, let me go back and say that I think I can say confidently that we at the chamber wholeheartedly agree with Delegate Feldmark insofar as we think that there should be a process for evaluation. That obviously the times change, policy changes, and so regularly evaluating tax credits and tax policy benefits all of us. And so we would agree that having that kind of review process is important. I think where we balked was that the original proposal was a straight elimination or modification. And then, of course, as we got into hearings, we learned more about what the intended purpose was, and we were fully ready to come to the table and have that conversation. But in its beginning, it was sort of this idea that, why are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Why are we going to try to look at all of this and throw it all out at the same time? The concern that we had as the process evolved was that other things started being folded in. So, for example, the R&D tax credit became part of that debate, and fundamentally changing the R&D tax credit and how it was applied and who would be eligible for it was part of that debate as we got toward the end of our 70 days. And that gave us some concerns. But I think certainly ready to come to the table and have those conversations and be part of the evaluation process, recognizing that it's true. Sometimes, our policies don't have their intended outcome, and we should have a framework for regularly reviewing them and a trigger for fixing those issues. But the idea that we should just blanket eliminate or modify without a thoughtful stakeholder process of evaluating them was where we sort of had our major issue. And to Delegate Feldmark's point, we're ready to come to the table and have those conversations in the interim when we can have a more prolonged discussion and thoughtful analysis of them, rather than trying to do it in a rushed, sort of frenetic 90-day session where we're not fully clear on what the intended outcome was. So that's where you got a lot of the pushback, was really, are we just trying to get rid of all of these things that and all of them have, each and every tax credit or program has at least a handful of folks that really live and die by it, right? And they're going to come to the table and fight for them tooth and nail. But we just needed the time and the bandwidth to be able to more thoughtfully evaluate what those were going to be. And so I think I look forward to working with Delegate Feldmark and with the committee next session to, and in the interim, to figure out what that bill is going to look like when we come back. But we're certainly ready to come to the table and have the conversation.
Okay. So speaking of what things are going to look like when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about HB 732 and 932, both big tax increases on business. That's, I think it's $200 million projected. Want to check in first, though. It's 9:15. We have 15 minutes left. So we'll go through a little bit of discussion on, I don't want to spend too much time on these two tax bills, but talk a little bit about, I think it's clear that the governor is going to veto these. They'll probably be overturned. Where do we think we are? I know that with the digital advertising tax, we fully expect that Google and Facebook and Yahoo and everyone will fight that. So we're going to incur legal fees as a state. Can you talk about that a little bit? We'll start with you, Ashley, and then move through the legislators.
Sure. So, I know that on the digital advertising tax on gross revenue from digital advertising, which later got folded in and passed as House Bill 732. I think, to your point, Duane, there are innumerable constitutional challenges to be made to that bill. We would be the first state in the country to have that kind of program or that kind of policy in place, incurring a long, protracted sort of litigation situation. We opposed it, but I think the bigger point to make in that is that it's not just about the Facebooks and the Googles. I know that they were the intended target, and that's how it played out in debate, but all things have a trickle-down effect. And so the role that the chamber played in this conversation is, and I know I was asked during the hearing, well, how many members do you have that have, this amount of gross revenue from digital advertising? And the answer is all of them. All of my members have to use advertising, and increasingly that's in a digital space, right?
Every one of my clients.
Yeah, that's the economy of the future. So the trickle-down effect of that, whether you believe it or not, it's real. It's going to happen. And so I think that is an important part of this as well, beyond just let's just say hypothetically we go through a litigation and there is some constitutional standing for this being able to go into place. It's really important that all businesses understand that even though the intended target of this was Google and Facebook, there are some really real cost implications for all businesses that advertise on digital spectrum. So I think I can't read the tea leaves. I mean, I feel reasonably confident, obviously, that the governor is going to veto it. I don't know what the legislature will do by way of veto override. I can't predict that. I wish, like Senator Hester, I had a crystal ball. I probably wouldn't work at the chamber and I'd get paid a lot more money. But, we'll have to see. We're going to continue to advocate for that idea that this impacts all businesses, not just your Facebooks and your Googles.
And with the other bill I mentioned, we'll all be paying every time we download an article or a video or a song or whatever as a sales tax. And I guess for the delegate and the legislate and the senator, I'm sorry, as you're answering this, I think the bigger picture here is these were really talked about. These tax increases were really talked about as helping to support where we're going with Kerwin. But of course, they're a drop in the bucket. So where are we going to get the rest of that money? We've got some tax increases on business. We're always worried that there's going to be more tax increases on business, but where's the rest of that going to come from? And where in here do we work on spending? Senator, start with you.
I think there's a couple of contextual comments I just like to make. I mean, I want to remind folks, I'm just looking at my notes. What was it? HB 1628, the sales and use tax rate reduction in services.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was on the front page of a couple papers. that
was a rough one.
Yeah. So I think nobody liked that. So let's all be thankful that we are not there right now.
3.7 billion.
Exactly. The bills that did pass, they all, once again, things are moving fast at the end there. And the revenues from the two bills that did pass are going to go into backfill to support recovery from the pandemic.
Okay.
And I think that is incredibly important to understand. It was hard for, me to think about some of these taxes, which will apply to in the face of a health crisis and small mom and pop micro shops on Main Street in Ellicott City and Sykesville and, Clarksville, those are the kind of folks that, as well as like local governments and, people who get sick, it's hard to not vote for something when that's where those folks are, that money's going to go for. At the same time, it's really important that we modernize, our tax code. I mean, if you're looking at digital downloads and you're looking at your corner bookstore, I mean, I don't know how many record stores there are anymore, but we need to have an overall look at the revenue stream. In fact, if you don't have to do this now, but one of the bills that came out of our bipartisan small business working group was on a commission for tax policy reform and fairness. I don't think we've taken a big look at tax credits or tax policy in 30 to 40 years. And so what this bill would have done was to establish a commission to study the current revenue structure of the state and make recommendations from a multi-stakeholder approach to the governor that uses the rubric of creating a business-friendly environment, promoting job growth and economic development while maintaining this steady supply revenue stream. And
will you be pushing that next session? And do you have a feel for where your colleagues stand with it? Will it be entertained? Because that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was a co-sponsor on that bill and I would co-sponsor it again. It was the vice chair of budget and tax, Senator Feldman. It was his bill and it did have bipartisan support. And I mean, let's face it, the world looks different now, and it's going to look different. And if there was ever a time to modernize things, it's probably now.
Yeah, if I might, Duane, just chime in for a second. I think we very much supported there were multiple bills. There was the Senate Small Working Group bill. There was one in the House that I think Chairwoman Kaiser had put forward for similar effort to try to study the tax code. We very much supported that as the pathway of having a stakeholder process of everyone coming to the table and figuring out how do we need to modernize. Where can we come to agreement on those places where there is some room to change policy to achieve some of the other goals, right? Whether it's education spend or later it's going to be infrastructure. And now it's post-COVID. And what I think part of what our chamber plan and proposal is going to be in a post-COVID is utilizing that same sort of structure, but changing it slightly. I think as we came into session, those commissions were to look at how do we raise revenue to pay for Kerwin. I would argue that now that's a good framework for us to look at how do we alter or change tax policy to support our business community in economic recovery. And that is the bill's already fully baked. It has bipartisan support. And if we could just tweak it slightly, some of the language to have this stakeholder group, of which the chamber was listed in the language, and we're grateful to be a part of that process, obviously. They are a tremendous tool to be used as we look forward to recovery of how we can change some of our tax policies to support businesses through this time. And I think it's timely and relevant, and we look forward to really being a part of that.
Wonderful. Delegate?
Yeah, if I can, I think, echo a lot of what was said, and also to add to it, a key piece as we look at tax code that we need to focus on is the shifting reality we're in, and how do we achieve fairness in that changing landscape, right? So we had the digital download piece, as the senator mentioned. You know, if you're a bookstore selling a book, there's sales tax. If someone downloads an ebook, the same book, shouldn't they, from a competitive standpoint, be charged the same sales tax? Especially, I mean, and right now we're in a state where that brick and mortar store, the government has closed, you know, and the online sales are continuing. So I think we need to look at both evolving to keep up with what our modern society entails and how our modern economy works. And it's also a question of fairness. We had two versions of bills dealing with the same issue with rental cars, right? Car rental businesses versus car sharing apps, you know? And so I think that there is, and again, we mentioned earlier, right? There's diversity within the business community. And so there are business interests on both sides of some of these issues. And we need to really look collaboratively and comprehensively at how we deal with them fairly and effectively.
Thank you. So I really wanted to get into some discussions about competitive advantage and disadvantage and relative to policies in Virginia and some of our competing states. But I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It's 9:24. So what I'd like to do now is begin to wrap up and just give you all the floor for a few minutes. I know there's probably some pet projects and bills that we didn't cover as much as you may have wanted. So why don't we take a few minutes and let's stick with you, Delegate, and just start to wrap up and each take 2 or 3 minutes.
Sure. So I think, you know, I mentioned briefly in my opening a few of the business highlights, and we have talked about some of them, not in great detail. So just really clearly to really quickly to clarify on a couple of them. Senator Hester spoke about the pass-through entity income tax issue. That is I think, a huge win-win. And this is something that is revenue neutral for the state and will save small business owners throughout the state collectively $425 million. And so I think that is a big win. And as the senator mentioned, if you're not familiar with it, please talk to your accountant about it and make sure you take advantage. And in terms of competitive advantage, particularly competing with Virginia, the data center tax bill that we passed, it is exempting data center equipment from sales and use tax and enabling local governments to provide personal property tax relief for data centers. And that is something that I think is, again, going to be a win-win. Data centers not only include jobs in terms of their construction and operation, but are major anchors for other employers in looking at where they want to locate. And finally, the small business innovation, research, and technology transfer. This would establish a state matching grant program for businesses who get federal SBIR grants for looking at commercialization of technology from federal research. And this is, you know, I know our local economic development authority has done a great job focusing on technology transfer, working with the Applied Physics Lab, working with the Defense Technology Commercialization Center. And this is just another opportunity to look at technology transfer, focusing specifically on federal research opportunities. So I think those are some important things. And if anyone is interested, I also want to highlight quickly one of our local delegation bills was tax relief for the Live Where You Work program. And for folks who aren't familiar with that, that's a new affordable housing program that's part of the Downtown Columbia Plan. Howard County General Hospital stepped up as our first participating employer to help employees with lower incomes be able to afford to live in downtown Columbia. So I want to recognize and thank Howard County General Hospital and any employer who is in or around downtown Columbia. If you're interested, reach out to me for more information. We'd love to get some more employers involved.
Great. Thank you, Delegate Feldmark. Senator Hester?
Yeah, really quickly, I just put in the chat box. I am doing a teletown hall tonight at 7 p.m. if you want to call in with our former Secretary of Health, Dr. Sharfstein. It's all going to be about get your questions on COVID-19 answered. So if anybody wants to join in, that's in the chat box. As the chair of the Joint Committee, which Delegate Feldmark serves on with me on cybersecurity and IT and biotech, we had a number of bills that didn't quite make it through. But I think as we've seen in the past year, with the ransomware attack in Baltimore and small county governments like Dorchester getting attacked, I think it's just critical. And I'll continue to fight for investment in state IT infrastructure. And at the local level, we had a great bill that would have used state support for our local county and small business, support on cybersecurity infrastructure. The last thing that I just wanted to say is that, I'm in great communication with the Secretary of Commerce, and we are getting some updates. I know people are out there waiting to know if they got their relief loan fund, their relief grant fund, the manufacturing funds. And it looks like the bottom line, I think, is that if you're still in the queue, there's a lot of people in the queue, but they're working slowly through that process. They just really wanted me to share with this group that they're going as fast as they can. The money is not yet exhausted. It's just taken a while to get it out. So don't lose hope.
Great. Thank you. Ashley, take us home.
Sure. Delegate Feldmark and Senator Hester sort of stole some of my thunder. I did want to mention that, the data center bill was one we didn't talk about. It was a coalition that was led by the chamber and about 60 organizations from around the state in support of that bill, which provides a tax exemption for the equipment that goes into a data center. And I think now more than ever, as we move toward working from home and more digital platforms and all of the things that we're seeing in the transition of our economy, having that benefit for Maryland is critically important, because data centers we're going to see over the next year plus are going to play an increasingly important role. So it was very fortuitous timing, and we're very grateful to the legislature for making that happen. And I know my coalition was having a victory dance on March 17th when we finally got that over the goal line. So that was a really good one. Just in my closing, I want to just say a few things about the Maryland Chamber's COVID response. Please visit our webpage. We are keeping that up to date in real time with all of the things that are rolling through, all of the updates that are transpiring. To Leonardo's point, we are also sending out daily communication on updates. And just two products that I wanted to plug. I know that most of you are probably aware that the Maryland Department of Commerce is working through a series of advisory groups on recommended best practices for reopening the economy once we get into that phase. Not prescribing when that will be or how it should be, but when it happens, what should it look like for employers? And earlier this week, we released a sort of baseline guide for employers to start thinking about some of the key considerations for employers as you're thinking about what reopening is going to look like for you, what specific things you're going to have to start thinking about putting in place to be a safe workplace. And it lives on our website. It's an infographic and accompanying written piece. So I'd encourage you to visit that. And then also, I sort of alluded to this in my remarks, but we are working on a Maryland Chamber Renew Maryland plan, which is sort of our vision and our menu of options, our policy proposals that will help support the business community in the near, mid, and long term as we try to not only be resilient through the COVID crisis and recover from it, but then also grow beyond it and what a new economy is going to look like. And so that plan is getting its final touches on it and should be available for public consumption within the next week. And of course, look forward to working with our local and county chambers on their ideas, and also obviously with the legislature on figuring out how we can put some of those things into place. And so just grateful for the partnership with Senator Hester and Delegate Feldmark. Both great partners to the chamber, and look forward to engaging with them moving forward.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks to all three of you for your participation. Leonardo?
Yes,
Take it back.
All right. Well, thank you, Duane, and thank you, Ashley, and Delegate Feldmark and Senator Hester.
On mute, I think.
Is it?
You see your
correct.
screen.
Yeah, correct. So thank you, Duane, and thank you also Ashley and Delegate Feldmark and Senator Hester for joining us and sharing. I thought we really had a very solid discussion of the issues and really how I think now we're really are seeing truly how policy just continues to connect and so forth, as we were able to talk about obviously what took place, but how that ties into what we're dealing with now and even where do we go in the days ahead. I want to just bring to everyone's attention that are still with us really quickly, 3 upcoming events on the chamber end. The first is coming up actually this evening, which will be something fun. So we've obviously been talking about serious issues right now from a legislative matter, but as it relates to this evening, we'll be doing Screen the Table. And so that'll be some fun networking, but at the same time starting to support our restaurants by continuing to provide them exposure, as we'll have with us the lead chef from Ada Bistro that will be walking us through how to prepare certain dishes. In 2 weeks, we'll come back with other restaurants. We've got Silver Diner on tap. We've got Hudson Coastal. We've got Walrus, Oyster Bar, and Ale House. We've got probably about 10 restaurants lined up where we'll be able to network, but at the same time, learn how to cook some of our favorite dishes. And also next week, we'll have a COVID-19 briefing with Tom Barkin, who is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And so that's coming up. And then lastly, also back to supporting our local businesses and restaurant merchants with cocktails, mocktails, and carryout. So again, the whole idea is prepare your favorite drink, whether that's alcoholic or non-alcoholic, as in my case, but also be able to order food from your favorite establishment and talk about maybe why you've ordered what you've ordered and why you'd recommend it. And so again, we thank you all for joining us. We'll be in touch and have a great rest of your day and stay safe.
Thanks so much. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.